On June 4, 1942, at 7:10 a.m., Ensign Albert Ernest prepared to board a Grumman TBF Avenger aircraft at Eastern Island in Midway Atoll, knowing the mission ahead was likely to be his last. The 25-year-old Richmond native had completed 6 combat missions, but had yet to successfully drop a torpedo. Intelligence reports indicated that a Japanese fleet consisting of 4 carriers and other heavy vessels were spotted approximately 180 miles northwest. Ernest would be flying directly into this formidable force, carrying a weapon with a failure rate of around 70%. Radioman III Harry Ferrier, aged just 17, and from Springfield, Massachusetts, was seated in the turret behind him, ensuring that his .50 caliber machine gun was operational. Seaman First Class J. Manning, who hailed from Seattle and was only 19 years old, manned the belly gun. This trio had been flying together for exactly 3 days. The Grumman TBF Avenger was the most advanced torpedo bomber in the American inventory at that time. It boasted a powerful twin-row radial engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower and reaching speeds up to 300 miles per hour. The aircraft could house a 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo within its internal bomb bay. Despite being technologically superior on paper, the Avenger faced one critical flaw: its torpedoes often malfunctioned. The Mark 13 torpedoes required precise conditions to function correctly, dropped from under 130 feet, and at speeds below 130 miles per hour. Any deviation resulted in a high likelihood of failure. They could break apart upon hitting the water, fail to arm properly, a 36% probability. Sink immediately, 20%, veer off course, 20%, or run at an incorrect depth, 18%. Only 31% functioned as intended. The Navy was well aware of these issues. The Bureau of Ordnance had meticulously recorded every instance of failure. Reports from Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and other engagements consistently highlighted the same issues: torpedoes failing to run, arm, or detonate. Pilots were sacrificing their lives attempting to deliver malfunctioning weapons. Everyone knew who was responsible for these failures: the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. This station oversaw every aspect of torpedo production since 1923, encompassing design, manufacturing, and testing for the entire U.S. Navy. There was no competition, alternative suppliers, or pressure to enhance performance. Representatives from Rhode Island's congressional delegation safeguarded the Newport facility's monopoly on torpedo manufacturing. Any efforts to establish new factories elsewhere were thwarted in committee meetings, while any critiques of torpedo effectiveness were hidden within classified documents. Workers at Newport adhered strictly to peacetime work schedules, operating a standard 40-hour week without overtime. They produced only 100 Mark 13 torpedoes monthly when the Navy required 500. Ernest joined a 6-plane detachment under Lieutenant Langdon Feebling. Within an hour, 5 out of the 6 Avengers would be shot down, and not one torpedo would explode. Both Feebling and Charles Brannan would perish in the operation. Oswald Gania, Victor Lewis, and Darrell Woodside would all be dead along with their entire gunner crews, resulting in a total of 15 fatalities. These men perished while attempting to deliver defective torpedoes that were unlikely to function even if they reached their targets. Ernest was the sole survivor, successfully landing his shot on Avenger despite it being riddled with 64 bullet holes and suffering from cannon hits. His turret gunner had been killed, and Ferrier was wounded. Ernest's torpedo had fallen into the ocean somewhere along its path. Damage to its release mechanism caused by Japanese gunfire rendered it unreliable. He could never be certain if his weapon would have operated properly. The issue wasn't related to pilot proficiency or tactical planning, nor did it stem from any shortcomings in the aircraft itself. The root cause lay beneath the surface of the water, specifically in what occurred when the torpedo entered it. The Mark 13 torpedo, measuring 22.4 inches in diameter and stretching 13 feet 5 inches with a weight of 2216 pounds, housed a warhead containing 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, 50% more powerful than TNT. This explosive payload alone was theoretically capable of crippling any ship it struck. However, for the torpedo to inflict such damage, it first needed to hit its target accurately. For that to happen, it had to run reliably after being launched. But before running effectively, it needed to survive the impact with the water upon release. Given that water is nearly incompressible, a high-speed entry is akin to colliding with concrete. The Mark 13 torpedo's internal mechanisms were originally designed for aircraft flying at speeds of around 80 miles per hour and dropping torpedoes from an altitude of approximately 50 feet, a scenario far removed from the realities faced during this conflict. By 1942, torpedo bombers could reach speeds of 300 miles per hour, yet the torpedo itself had not advanced technologically. The gyroscope that regulated its direction would break if exposed to more than 10 Gs of deceleration. When entering water at a speed of 150 miles per hour, the impact generated approximately 15 Gs additionally. The depth control system, which consisted of a hydrostatic valve and pendulum mechanism, could malfunction if the torpedo's entry angle exceeded 30 degrees. The propeller shaft would bend, unless the torpedo struck the water surface in an absolutely level position. The Bureau of Ordnance was well aware of these limitations. Extensive testing at Newport had revealed them. To address these issues, they imposed strict drop parameters that left torpedo bombers extremely vulnerable. Pilots were instructed to fly straight and level at 130 miles per hour, and an altitude of 100 feet directly towards the target ship. They needed to maintain this course for a minimum of 10 seconds before releasing the torpedoes to allow their gyroscopes to stabilize properly. Release had to occur precisely at a range of 800 yards. Any deviation from these guidelines would result in torpedo malfunction. Adhering to such stringent parameters meant exposing pilots to intense anti-aircraft fire for upwards of 30 seconds, essentially guaranteeing a high risk of being shot down. These issues with the Mark 13 torpedoes were first documented as early as July 1941 during a training exercise involving Torpedo Squadron 6. Under ideal conditions, 10 torpedoes were dropped. Only 5 exploded on impact, and 4 sank without detonating properly while 1 ran erratically. This incident occurred 11 months prior to the Battle of Midway and 5 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Testing conducted by the Navy at Naval Air Station Patuxent River revealed that dropping torpedoes at speeds exceeding 150 knots caused the rear fins to collapse, leading to damage of the delicate steering mechanisms upon impact with water. As a result, the torpedoes would either sink, spin in circles, or bounce along the surface. In some cases, the warheads detached entirely. After analyzing recovered Mark 13 torpedoes following the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, critical issues were identified. 3 failed torpedoes that had executed perfect drops were closely examined. All 3 possessed intact warheads and had armed correctly. However, the Mark VI exploding mechanism was found to be at fault due to its overly fragile firing pin. When a torpedo struck a ship's hull from an angle other than perpendicular, the firing pin would bend or break before triggering the detonator. Engineers concluded that with typical approach angles and high speeds, the Mark VI would fail to explode in around 40% of cases, even on direct hits. Reports detailing these issues were submitted to the Bureau of Ordnance on May 20, 1942, but they were classified as secret and filed away without any action being taken or modifications approved. Consequently, pilots continued to perish due to faulty weaponry. By August 1942, American torpedo bomber losses in the Pacific had become catastrophic. Midway saw 15 TBD Devastators from Hornet being shot down without scoring any hits. 6 Avengers based at Midway Island also faced attacks, with 5 of them falling to enemy fire and no hits registered. In the eastern Solomons area, 7 Avengers were lost. However, they managed to sink a light carrier only due to multiple torpedoes hitting their mark despite frequent failures in detonation. Most of these torpedoes that struck did not explode. During the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, losses escalated further. Lieutenant Commander John Collett led Torpedo Squadron 10 from Enterprise in an attack on Japanese carriers. From a textbook-perfect position, Collett's squadron released 12 torpedoes at the carrier Zuikaku, adhering to standard height and speed parameters. Only 2 torpedoes made contact, but neither exploded. Immediately after his attack run, Collett's Avenger was shot down by 0 fighters. His gunner, William Woods, a radio operator and second-class aviation specialist, sent a final message before perishing at the age of 19. His body remains unrecovered. Ensign George Morgan from the same squadron survived the battle but noted in his diary that night, "We might as well be dropping telephone poles for all the good these torpedoes do." Meanwhile, Tommy Morrison successfully achieved an optimal drop on a cruiser earlier in the day. The torpedo struck right among the ships, but it didn't penetrate. Instead, it simply sank after bouncing off. 30 seconds later, Tommy was shot down. His final message over the radio was a curse directed at the Bureau of Ordnance. In November 1942, Lieutenant Bruce Harwood from Torpedo Squadron 6 penned a letter to his wife which, despite heavy censorship, still conveyed his frustration. He wrote that they were being tasked with the impossible using faulty equipment. Over the past month, 6 of his closest friends had perished during flawless attack runs. If we lose this war, it won't be due to poor pilots or aircraft. Rather, it will stem from a refusal to acknowledge and rectify issues. The censors excised all mentions of torpedo malfunctions. Yet Harwood's widow grasped the true meaning when she received his belongings following his death at Guadalcanal in January 1943. Every pilot knew about the defective torpedoes, and every squadron across the Pacific was aware. They discussed it openly in ready rooms and even wrote about it in letters home, though these were heavily censored by the authorities. Despite this, they continued to carry out their missions as a matter of duty. Some began searching for alternative solutions. In late 1942, the California Institute of Technology was brought into addressing the torpedo issue not by the Navy itself, but through the National Defense Research Committee, an advisory board tasked with mobilizing American technological resources for wartime needs. The Bureau of Ordnance maintained that the Mark 13 torpedo was adequate and refused assistance from outside sources. It was only the pilots who were dropping them improperly, they claimed. Dr. Charles Lauritsen was skeptical of the conventional approach. As a physicist at Caltech, he had been involved in rocket development before being tasked with investigating torpedo issues. Despite having no prior experience with torpedoes, his expertise in physics and hydrodynamics made him well-versed in understanding what happens when objects strike water at high velocities. In January 1943, Lauritsen's team established a testing facility near Morris Dam northeast of Los Angeles. They constructed a 300-foot-long slide along the dam's face. Below lay Morris Reservoir, famous for its exceptionally clear waters that facilitated underwater high-speed photography. The tests began with dummy torpedoes identical in size and weight to Mark 13 models. Various cameras were set up. High-speed ones on the slide, underwater units in the reservoir, and additional equipment aboard boats tracking torpedo trajectories. What they found was revolutionary. The Navy's manual instructed pilots to approach targets at a constant altitude and speed, release torpedoes from a precise distance, and continue straight ahead until impact. However, Lauritsen's footage revealed that this method resulted in the worst possible water entry. The film showed that during descent, the torpedo would swing back and forth like a pendulum due to oscillations. This led to unpredictable angles of impact, sometimes flat, nose first or tail first, which caused varied types of malfunctions. Flat strikes compressed the 2,000-pound weapon, causing it to flex like an accordion and damaging internal parts such as the gyroscope and depth control mechanism. The propeller shaft would likely bend. Even if the torpedo managed to activate, it might veer off course or rise to the surface. A nose-first impact would push it too deep underwater. Designed to run at a 10-foot depth, such an entry could send it down to as far as 50 feet before the depth control mechanism responded. This could result in the torpedo being beneath the target's hull or damaging the warhead detonator due to pressure changes. A tail-first impact was even worse. The propeller and rudders would be the first to hit, potentially bending or breaking off entirely. The torpedo would then lack direction and propulsion, simply sinking. Lauritsen determined that at standard drop speeds, there was only a 15-degree window of acceptable entry angles, with less than a 20% chance of achieving this naturally. It turned out that everything the Navy believed about dropping torpedoes was incorrect. The doctrine suggested low and slow drops to minimize water impact, but the films revealed that such conditions caused the torpedo to belly flop, crushing internal mechanisms even at slower speeds. To ensure proper entry, the torpedo needed an angle between 20 and 25 degrees. Too shallow would cause it to skip, while too steep could result in diving too deep or breaking apart. Achieving this precise angle from a height of 100 feet at 130 miles per hour was nearly impossible, requiring perfect judgment of distance, speed, altitude, and release point amid anti-aircraft fire. Lauritsen proposed an idea: stabilizing the torpedo during its descent to control its entry angle regardless of drop height or speed. His group began exploring various attachments to modify the torpedo's flight behavior. They experimented with small parachutes and metal fins, yet these solutions proved either overly intricate or unreliable. Metal fins were particularly problematic as they added significant weight, negatively impacting underwater performance. One day, an individual whose identity faded into memory proposed investigating how the Japanese handled their torpedo drops during the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese Kate bombers had devastated the harbor with Type 91 torpedoes equipped with wooden box fins attached to their rear ends. Upon hitting water, these boxes detached and served as stabilizers for the torpedoes in freefall. American intelligence recovered several unexploded Type 91 torpedoes from Pearl Harbor, noting the wooden attachments, but deeming them primitive and unnecessary. The Japanese had spent 3 years perfecting these box fins, known as stabilizer plates. During testing at Kagoshima Bay in 1939, Japanese naval aviators faced similar issues with their Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers dropping Type 91 torpedoes, which failed more than half the time. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would later lead the Pearl Harbor assault, oversaw numerous stabilizer design tests involving over 2,000 trial drops. Unaware of this extensive research and development, American analysts dismissed these wooden attachments as crude and irrelevant. However, Lauritsen remained open-minded. His team crafted their own wooden box fins for testing at Morris Dam. While the boxes did stabilize the torpedoes during freefall, they generated excessive drag, significantly slowing the weapon and causing it to lose forward momentum and tumble. They required a superior solution. Dr. L. A. Durbridge, Another physicist from Caltech working with Lauritsen's team proposed using an airfoil design rather than a box. An airfoil would reduce drag while maintaining stability. After experimenting with various configurations, they settled on an aluminum ring shaped like the cross-section of an airplane wing. This ring would encircle the torpedo's tail fins and be secured in place with 4 steel bolts. They named this innovation a shroud ring. The first test took place on March 15, 1943, when they dropped a mock torpedo from the Morris Dam slide at a speed equivalent to a 200-knot aircraft release. Upon entering the water, the torpedo submerged at exactly 22 degrees, the ideal angle they had calculated. It traveled in a straight line for 800 yards before retrieval. Remarkably, the shroud ring remained intact and undamaged. They conducted this test 50 times. 48 torpedoes operated flawlessly. 2 exhibited slight deviations that were still within acceptable limits. Instead of wooden boxes, Lauritsen's team developed an aluminum ring in an airfoil shape designed to fit around the torpedo's tail fins, which they dubbed a shroud ring. During tests at Morris Dam, the shroud ring served 2 primary functions. Firstly, it maintained stability during the torpedo's descent by preventing tumbling and oscillation. Secondly, it bolstered the delicate tail fins to prevent them from collapsing upon impact. Interestingly, despite remaining attached underwater, the airfoil design of the shroud rings actually enhanced the torpedo's stability in aquatic conditions. Torpedoes equipped with these rings exhibited straighter trajectories, without any erratic movement or circular patterns. However, this solution addressed only part of the issue since high-altitude and high-speed drops still posed a problem due to excessive impact forces that could damage internal mechanisms. To tackle this challenge, Lauritsen's team explored several drag devices, including fabric streamers that became entangled and metal plates that compromised accuracy. They eventually settled on a simple plywood ring placed around the torpedo's nose. This contraption looked absurdly like a barrel encircling the warhead. When Navy pilots first saw it, they nicknamed it the pickle barrel. Remarkably effective, this device generated sufficient drag to decelerate the torpedo's fall by 40% in conjunction with the shroud ring. Consequently, it enabled safe deployment from an altitude of 800 feet at a speed of 260 knots, ensuring proper entry into water. Upon impact, the pickle barrel would detach, allowing the torpedo to function normally. In April 1944, Lauritsen's team presented their findings in a demonstration for naval officials. They dropped 6 torpedoes from a Navy bomber flying at an altitude of 1,000 feet and a speed of 300 knots. All 6 aircraft entered the water smoothly. Each one performed efficiently, maintaining a straight course without deviation. Navy officials remained doubtful about these results. After all, these were laboratory tests conducted under ideal conditions. Real combat scenarios presented entirely different challenges. The squadron mechanics had been anticipating such an opportunity. When news of Caltech's modifications circulated unofficially in May 1944, both mechanics and pilots contacted Lauritsen directly. They asked if they could implement the changes, to which he responded affirmatively but emphasized that it would be unauthorized. Approval from the Bureau of Ordnance was lacking, yet this did not deter them. First-class aviation machinists' mate mechanics traveled from various squadrons across the country to California for training sessions. These meetings took place in a nondescript warehouse located near Naval Air Station facilities. To avoid detection by official Navy inspectors, Lauritsen and his team established a workshop away from formal Navy premises. The warehouse had an industrial scent of machine oil mixed with freshly cut plywood. Workbenches lined the walls, cluttered with torpedo components, measuring tools, and peculiar-looking shroud rings and pickle barrels. Lauritsen personally instructed the mechanics on how to install these modifications. Attaching the shroud ring required meticulous attention. 4 holes needed drilling through the torpedo's tail cone at precise locations. Placing the aluminum too close to the edge risked cracking it under stress, while positioning it too far inside could impede the control surfaces. Each bolt needed to be tightened precisely to 35 foot-pounds. If they were too loose, the ring might move during flight, and if overly tight, they could warp the tail cone. The pickle barrel was simpler but still demanded exactitude. Constructed from 3/4-inch marine plywood, it formed a circular frame with a diameter of 40 inches and an inner hole measuring 24 inches across. This structure was split in half along one side to create a hinged assembly that could be opened around the torpedo's nose and secured using 4 steel bands tightened to exactly 50 pounds of tension with turnbuckles. The mechanics spent days practicing on mock torpedoes, receiving guidance from Lauritsen's team who corrected their techniques. They taught them how to verify alignment, assess attachment strength, and ensure that modifications would not obstruct the loading process into the Avenger's bomb bays. Once trained, they could install these changes in just 20 minutes. Detailed drawings, exact measurements, material requirements, and comprehensive installation instructions were provided by Lauritsen to facilitate replication of the work. All documentation was marked as unofficial without approval from the Bureau of Ordnance, stamped in red ink. Lauritsen instructed them to disseminate this information discreetly among squadron mechanics. If the Bureau discovered widespread unauthorized modifications before combat-proven effectiveness, all operations would be halted. Lauritsen's team demonstrated to Chen how to attach both shroud rings and pickle barrels. The shroud ring was anchored with 4 bolts passing through the tail section of the torpedo, while the pickle barrel was fastened using metal bands around the body of the weapon. The changes increased the weight of the torpedoes by 32 pounds, which was insignificant compared to the enhanced reliability they provided. Chen returned to Yorktown and discreetly modified 12 torpedoes during nighttime hours after regular maintenance shifts. He informed the squadron pilots about his actions, but everyone remained silent. Better to seek forgiveness later than permission up front. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, torpedo squadrons from Task Force 58 launched an attack on the Japanese carrier Hio using these modified torpedoes for the first time in combat. 8 Avengers dropped their payloads from a height of 600 feet at a speed of 220 knots, higher and faster than any previous successful torpedo assault. 6 out of 8 torpedoes followed their intended course accurately. 3 hit Hio, all 3 detonating upon impact, leading to the carrier's sinking. This marked the first instance during World War II that American aerial torpedoes functioned as intended in battle. The squadron commanders reported the success without disclosing the modifications. They claimed that luck had played a significant role in their successful drops. However, other pilots involved in the strike noticed distinct differences. The torpedoes entered the water smoothly and silently, with no splash or erratic movement, characteristics starkly different from those observed in earlier attacks. Upon landing, mechanics across Task Force 58 were approached by curious pilots eager to learn about any alterations made to the torpedoes. Eventually, the mechanics revealed the changes they had implemented. Within a span of 12 hours, all torpedoes housed in the fleet magazines were outfitted with shroud rings and pickle barrels. Mechanics toiled throughout the night alongside teams of volunteers. By sunrise on June 20, when the carriers commenced their strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet, each Avenger aircraft was armed with a modified torpedo. The outcomes were impressive. Out of the 24 torpedoes launched that day, 19 performed perfectly, running hot and straight as intended. This resulted in 2 destroyers being sunk and damage inflicted upon a cruiser. Notably, no Avengers fell victim to anti-aircraft fire. News of this success spread rapidly through Task Force 58. Pilots from the Enterprise visited other carriers to examine the modified torpedoes, while mechanics from the Lexington flew in code aircraft to study the installation process. Within just 1 week, copies of the installation diagrams had been disseminated across every carrier in the vast task force. When staff inspectors from the Bureau of Ordnance paid visits and observed mechanics openly installing pickle barrels during daylight hours, they filed urgent reports demanding that all modifications be removed and the individuals responsible face court-martial proceedings. These reports eventually reached Admiral Mark Mitchell, commander of Task Force 58. Having witnessed the combat results firsthand, Mitchell ordered that the modifications continue, prioritizing combat effectiveness over regulations. The alterations proceeded unabated. By August 1944, every torpedo squadron in the Pacific was equipped with shroud rings and pickle barrels. Although officially designated Mark 13, Mod 2A, the pilots simply referred to them as ring tails. The impact of these modifications was immediate and profound. In October, Avengers played a crucial role in sinking the super battleship Musashi with several torpedo strikes during the Battle of Midway Gulf. By April 1945, they managed to sink Musashi's sister ship, Yamato, using torpedoes that had previously failed miserably in 1942, but were now the most lethal weapons in the American arsenal. The Japanese military quickly noticed this shift. Commander Masataki Okumiya, air officer on board carrier Junio, documented in his after-action report from the Philippine Sea that American torpedoes suddenly became highly destructive, whereas earlier, Japanese vessels could withstand multiple hits without significant damage. Now, single torpedo strikes were causing catastrophic harm. Additionally, American aircraft were diving from heights and speeds previously thought impossible. This rendered the Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine of forcing torpedo bombers to low altitudes obsolete. In September 1944, Captain Toshikazu Amai, operations officer for the combined fleet, analyzed American torpedo effectiveness. He observed that the hit rate had climbed from less than 10% in 1942 to over 40% by mid-1944. Even more alarming was the increase in fatal damage caused by hits from 20% to 70%. The torpedoes were not only hitting their targets with greater frequency, but also detonating reliably. Amai advised that Japanese ships should avoid engaging American carrier forces until they could uncover the secret behind these improved weapons. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Hashimoto, tasked with investigating captured American equipment, examined 4 recovered Mark 13 torpedoes in October 1944. He observed a peculiar plywood ring around the nose and an aluminum shroud around the tail, but dismissed them as temporary shipping protections that would be removed before combat use. It never occurred to him that these simple additions could significantly enhance the performance of the torpedoes. His report concluded that the Americans must have developed some new internal mechanism, possibly electronic, to stabilize the torpedoes during flight. He suggested capturing intact Avengers for further study. Vice Admiral Takedo Kareta, commanding the Japanese center force at Midway Gulf, reported in frustration that American torpedo attacks had become overwhelmingly effective. His flagship Yamato sustained 8 torpedo hits. The battleship Musashi sank after suffering 19 torpedo strikes. Both it and its sister ship were believed to be unsinkable due to their robust torpedo defense systems, which were initially designed to counter the older, less reliable American torpedoes. The Japanese military failed to grasp what had changed. They analyzed crashed Avengers and recovered unexploded torpedoes, but found no evidence of modifications, as the shroud rings and pickle barrels appeared identical to those in use before. Unaware of the Morris Dam tests and lacking a full understanding of hydrodynamics, they were unable to identify the alterations made by the Americans. This development had a profound psychological impact on Japanese naval forces. Commander Yasumiyoshi Miura, executive officer of the cruiser Tone, recorded in his diary that American torpedo bombers now seemed like sea demons. Once, Japanese sailors watched torpedo attacks with confidence, knowing most torpedoes would miss or fail to detonate. Now they observed them with dread as the sight of Avengers approaching at high altitude was no longer reassuring. These aircraft were assumed to be carrying bombs, but actually dropped torpedoes. There was no safe distance or altitude anymore. This shift in American torpedo effectiveness completely transformed the Pacific Naval War. In 1942 and 1943, Japanese surface forces operated with relative freedom, able to withstand non-exploding torpedo hits and maneuver around erratically running torpedoes. However, by 1944, Japanese ships were being hunted relentlessly, leading to their near annihilation. The once formidable combined fleet, which had seemed invincible following the attack on Pearl Harbor, was reduced to scattered remnants hiding in harbors. Statistics tell the story. American torpedo bombers achieved a hit rate of less than 5% in 1942, with only half of those hits exploding. By late 1944, this figure surpassed 10% and reached over 40%, with nearly all hits resulting in explosions. The kill rate per sortie had risen by a factor of 15, turning what was once the riskiest and least successful mission in naval aviation into a precise ship-killing operation. By late autumn, the destruction became methodical. On October 24, 1944, waves of Avengers from Task Force 38 launched an attack on the Japanese battleship Musashi. The first wave inflicted 4 torpedo hits to her port side. Despite listing, she remained mobile. In the second wave, 3 more torpedoes struck her starboard side, correcting the list but flooding additional compartments. A third wave added 4 more torpedoes to the port side. The fourth wave delivered 6 more hits. Finally, the fifth and last wave put 3 more torpedoes into the sinking ship. Musashi capsized and sank at 1935, taking over 1,000 men with her. Each of these torpedoes had shroud rings and pickle barrels, and were dropped from altitudes between 400 and 800 feet at speeds ranging from 180 to 260 knots. According to the old doctrine, such drop parameters would have assured failure. However, thanks to Caltech modifications, they ensured success. Musashi, designed by Japanese naval architects to withstand 20 torpedo hits, succumbed after 19 due to each hit causing maximum damage. The following day, on October 25, Avengers located Yamato and her escorts off Samar. Lieutenant Commander William Isbell led 12 Avengers from the USS Hancock in the assault. They approached at an altitude of 8,000 feet, well beyond effective anti-aircraft range, then dove at 45-degree angles to release their torpedoes at a height of 600 feet while traveling at 250 knots. 10 out of 12 torpedoes found their marks accurately. 8 hit various ships in the formation. Yamato sustained 3 direct hits. Nagato, a cruiser, suffered 2 strikes. The remaining vessels were hit by destroyers. All detonated simultaneously with devastating force. This caused the formation to disintegrate and disrupted the movement of the cruiser. During the Japanese assault on American escort carriers near Samar, Lieutenant Robert Holcomb documented his experience in an after-action report while piloting one of the Avenger aircraft. He noted that the torpedo he launched barely made a splash upon entering the water, but proceeded straight ahead with no deviation whatsoever. It was as if someone had executed a flawless demonstration right before his eyes. The explosion against Yamato's hull created a towering column of water reaching 200 feet into the air. Holcomb expressed that, for the first time during torpedo runs, he felt absolute certainty about the weapon's effectiveness. The Navy's official history attributed this success to enhanced pilot training and strategic adjustments in tactics. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Ordnance's final report from 1946 claimed continuous improvements to the Mark 13 torpedo throughout World War II had significantly boosted its performance. However, these reports neglected to acknowledge that the enhancements were developed by civilian scientists operating through official channels. They also failed to mention the countless pilots who perished while carrying faulty weapons, despite Newport's insistence that there was no issue. Charles Lauritsen received a Presidential Medal for Merit in 1948, which recognized his significant contributions to rocket development and underwater weaponry. However, it did not specifically highlight his work on torpedo modifications. After the war, Lauritsen shifted his focus back to nuclear physics, contributing to the creation of the hydrogen bomb and later serving on the Atomic Energy Commission. He seldom discussed his torpedo work and would respond by saying they simply applied basic physics to an engineering challenge. In 1948, Charles Lauritsen was awarded the Presidential Medal for Merit. The citation highlighted his contributions to rocket development and underwater weaponry, but did not specifically reference the modifications he made to torpedoes. After World War II, Lauritsen returned to nuclear physics, contributed to hydrogen bomb research, and served on the Atomic Energy Commission. He rarely talked about his torpedo work. When asked, he would say that they merely applied basic physics to an engineering problem. The squadron commanders who utilized the unauthorized modifications survived the war and went on to train a generation of Navy pilots with the same narrative. They emphasized that sometimes the system fails and official channels don't always suffice. In such cases, individuals must decide whether adhering strictly to regulations is more crucial than saving lives. These squadron leaders never regretted their decisions to use unauthorized modifications, because they knew the pilots who returned due to those changes were evidence enough of their necessity. The mechanics who made these modifications left the Navy after the war and resumed civilian life in garages and machine shops across America. They had photographs on their office walls showing them standing next to Avengers equipped with ringtail torpedoes. When customers inquired about them, they would simply say they worked on aircraft during the war without mentioning the critical role their late-night modifications played in sinking the Japanese fleet. Aviation radioman First Class Harry Ferrier, who at 17 survived the June 4th attack at Midway with resolve, went on to fly 47 more combat missions. Since August 1944, each time he piloted an Avenger aircraft, he was confident that his torpedo would function properly. He understood that somewhere, someone had resolved the issue that had claimed so many of his comrades' lives. It wasn't until years after the war ended that he learned about Caltech, Morris Dam, and the pickle barrels. At the time, all he knew was that, miraculously, the torpedoes began to work without fail. In a 1998 interview, Ferrier recounted the stark contrast between pre- and post-modification torpedo runs. Prior to the improvements, each launch was an act of faith. You watched as the torpedo descended into the water, hoping it would run correctly and detonate upon impact. Typically, this did not happen. However, after late 1944, everything changed. The torpedoes behaved flawlessly, dropping smoothly and tracking steadily toward their targets. It was as if they were gliding along a rail, and when they struck, there was no doubt about an explosion. Every single time. Lieutenant George Bush, who would later become President of the United States, flew 58 combat missions from Avengers aboard USS San Jacinto during World War II. On September 2, 1944, while attacking a Japanese radio station off Chichijima, his aircraft was shot down. Tragically, both crew members, Lieutenant Junior Grade William White and Radio Man Second Class John Delaney, were killed in action. Bush managed to survive the ordeal thanks to rescue operations by USS Finback. Before being shot down, however, he had successfully deployed 4 modified torpedoes on earlier missions, leading to the sinking of a cargo ship and damaging a destroyer. In his memoir, Bush discussed how reliable torpedoes boosted pilot morale significantly. When you know your weapon will function correctly, it transforms everything. You can concentrate on flying, dodging flak, and ensuring your crew gets back home safely without worrying if your efforts are in vain. Ensign Jesse Brown, the Navy's first African-American aviator, flew Avengers with Torpedo Squadron 32 from USS Laddie during late 1944 and early 1945. His squadron exclusively used ringtail torpedoes. On his inaugural combat mission on January 4, 1945, Brown successfully launched a torpedo at a Japanese tanker off Formosa, which subsequently exploded and sank within 12 minutes. Later in life, he reflected that having reliable weaponry gave him the confidence to prove himself amidst skepticism from the Navy regarding African-American pilots' capabilities. He understood his success hinged on his proficiency rather than unreliable equipment. The modifications not only increased hit rates, but also saved lives through various means. Pilots could now drop torpedoes at higher altitudes and faster speeds, reducing exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Additionally, they could attack from multiple angles simultaneously, making it difficult for Japanese gunners to focus their defenses effectively. With a higher success rate of hits and explosions, fewer missions were required to sink each target. According to the Naval Aviation Safety Center's 1946 report, these torpedo improvements reduced Avenger combat losses by roughly 60% in the final year of World War II. Farrier lived until 2016 at age 90. In his later years, he traveled extensively to veteran gatherings, recounting the story of Torpedo Squadron 8 and those who perished at Midway due to faulty weapons systems. His talks always concluded with a poignant message. The young men who lost their lives in 1942 were not let down by lack of courage or skill, but by an administrative system that prioritized bureaucratic control over practical combat effectiveness. Their ultimate sacrifice was what compelled later improvements and changes. Each Japanese vessel destroyed by torpedoes after 1944 served as proof of the sacrifices made by those who perished in 1942 while attempting to deploy malfunctioning torpedoes. The Bureau of Ordnance never officially recognized the shortcomings of the Mark 13 torpedo in its initial design. In a report submitted to Congress in 1946, they claimed that torpedo performance had been adequate throughout the war with ongoing enhancements. However, they neglected to mention that these improvements were compelled by combat failures and civilian oversight. The document attributed Newport's development of the shroud ring modification while omitting Caltech's contribution entirely. It also suggested that the pickle barrel was a natural progression from existing drag reduction studies, disregarding Newport's rejection of such devices for 3 years as pilots lost their lives. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded amphibious forces throughout the Pacific War, wrote a confidential letter to Admiral King in December 1945. In this correspondence, he asserted that the torpedo crisis of 1942 and 1943 had resulted in more pilot casualties than any tactical mistake. He estimated that effective torpedoes could have shortened the conflict by 6 months. The letter was classified and stored away in Navy archives. Turner never disclosed his concerns publicly. As a result, the families of the fallen pilots were unaware of the truth. Barbara Feebling, the widow of Lieutenant Langdon Feebling, who led the TBF detachment at Midway, spent 40 years believing her husband had died in an honorable battle against superior Japanese forces. She discovered the reality about defective torpedoes only in 1987, when a historian interviewed her for a book on Midway. Overwhelmed with anger rather than sorrow, she wept upon learning that her husband's death was due to weapons known to be faulty by the Navy. Margaret Waldron, whose late husband, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, led Hornet's 15-plane squadron, received a letter from President Roosevelt praising his heroic effort against formidable odds. The message failed to mention that his squadron's torpedoes had less than a 30% chance of functioning, even if they reached their targets. Margaret kept this letter framed on her wall until she passed away in 1993. She remained unaware of the complete truth. For decades, the Newport Naval Torpedo Station operated as the Navy's main torpedo facility until 1951, when it was shuttered and production spread among various contractors. The exclusive control that had led to so many casualties quietly ceased without fanfare. An official inquiry into why civilian scientists were ultimately required to rectify an issue known since 1941 never took place. Classified documents detailing the Mark 13 torpedoes' failures stayed under wraps until 1972. The sole surviving ringtail torpedo is exhibited at the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola, with a plaque noting that modifications introduced in 1944 enhanced its performance. However, it fails to acknowledge the pilots who perished before these improvements or highlight that they originated from outside the Navy and were unauthorized. Institutional histories frequently omit failures within organizations, yet the true narrative is straightforward. An outsider with no torpedo expertise brought a fresh perspective to a critical issue. A lieutenant commander jeopardized his career to protect his fellow aviators. A mechanic labored through long nights implementing unapproved changes. Together, they transformed what was once considered one of America's worst torpedoes into an effective weapon that played a crucial role in the Pacific War. This is how technical progress often occurs during wartime, not via official procedures or bureaucratic processes, but by individuals identifying issues, devising solutions, and acting without waiting for permission to save lives. The Grumman TBF Avenger ultimately became the premier torpedo bomber of World War II. It wasn't due to its speed, agility, or armament. It was because someone finally gave it a reliable torpedo. The aircraft itself had always been capable, and the pilots were fearless. What they truly needed was a dependable weapon. Between 1942 and 1945, 81 Avenger aircraft were produced. They sank 29 Japanese carriers, battleships, and cruisers, as well as over 30 submarines. One of these torpedoes sent the largest ever-built battleship, Yamato, to its grave at the bottom of the sea. Their most significant triumph, however, was not in terms of tonnage sunk. It lay in solving problems that people knew could be overcome if someone dared to break the rules. The wooden pickle barrel and aluminum shroud ring, invented by physicists who had never seen combat, were developed in a mountain reservoir and saved more American pilots than any advancements in aircraft design or training. They turned the Battle of the Philippine Sea into what pilots dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 1945, when Japan's Navy launched kamikaze attacks as acts of desperation due to its inability to protect its ships conventionally, these torpedoes played a crucial role. Today, every military procurement program includes multiple contractors and competitive bidding processes with independent testing oversight. The lessons learned from the Mark 13 torpedo are now ingrained in the system. Yet those lessons were paid for with blood, by men who flew into Japanese anti-aircraft fire knowing their torpedoes likely wouldn't work, but hoping they might function properly this time. The full extent of the cost associated with the torpedo scandal has never been fully quantified. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison dedicated only 3 paragraphs in his official history of United States naval operations during World War II to the torpedo defects, calling them minor technical issues that were swiftly resolved. Despite having access to all classified reports and interviews with hundreds of participants, he knew the full truth about these events. Institutional history tends to downplay institutional shortcomings. Dr. Norman Friedman's comprehensive technical analysis of U.S. naval weapons during World War II revealed that if proper torpedoes had been available from the beginning, an additional 40 to 50 major Japanese warships could have been sunk by late 1943. This would have included most of the carriers involved in later battles, such as the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. The conflict might have ended 6 months to a year earlier, potentially saving thousands of American lives. However, the true cost goes beyond mere ships, time, or casualties. It lies in the erosion of trust between combat personnel and the bureaucratic system meant to support them. Each pilot who took off knowing their torpedo was likely ineffective. Every mechanic tasked with preparing aircraft for missions they knew were suicidal. And each squadron commander writing letters to widows aware that the deaths could have been prevented, all came to understand a harsh reality. Sometimes the system fails, and those in charge prioritize protecting their own positions over safeguarding those on the front lines. This lesson remains relevant today. Throughout every military conflict since World War II, be it issues with bazookas failing to penetrate enemy armor in Korea, M16 rifles jamming during combat in Vietnam, unarmored Humvees in Iraq, or radios malfunctioning in Afghanistan's mountainous terrain, the pattern has been consistent. The problem was known, and solutions existed. However, inertia within the bureaucracy, institutional pride, and political backing for contractors hindered necessary improvements until external pressure or a critical malfunction compelled changes. The Grumman TBF Avenger later played a crucial role in the Korean War due to its reliability and cargo-carrying capability, making it invaluable for close air support missions. It continued to serve with foreign naval forces well into the 1960s. Today, restored Avengers appear at airshows, their distinctive profile and roaring radial engines evoking memories of a time when carrier aviation matured. Yet, few spectators are aware of the true story behind how these aircraft became the premier torpedo bombers during World War II. If this account has resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the human cost of institutional failures in warfare technology. The next time you hear about military procurement controversies or malfunctioning weaponry, remember the Mark 13 torpedo. Remember that somewhere today, young service members are using equipment known to be flawed by someone else. And remember that such issues do not have to persist indefinitely. The designation as the best torpedo bomber of World War II did not solely depend on the aircraft itself, but rather on the quality of its torpedoes. It was people willing to work beyond the established system who ultimately ensured the creation of effective torpedoes and saved lives. That is truly the essence of the Avengers' legacy.